Hello and welcome to this podcast recorded by the Argus European Products team. This is part of the Driving Discussions podcast series, and the subject we're going to talk about today is the tariffs that Donald Trump is imposing on his Mexican and Canadian neighbors. Or rather, I should say the tariffs he might impose on his Mexican and Canadian neighbors, because it seems to be the strategy of the Trump White House to create uncertainty about when the tariffs will come into effect, how long they'll be in effect for, what exact shape they'll take. It was in early February that he announced that these tariffs were coming into effect the next day on Mexico and Canada, but within hours he had said that in both cases they would be postponed for another month. Then in early March he said they were coming into effect, and to all intents and purposes they did come into effect on the 4th of March, but just 2 days later the tariffs on Mexico were suspended for another month. The tariffs on Canada at the time of recording appear to be remaining in effect, but who knows what will happen. So the conversation we're about to have should really be read as what we expect would happen if the tariffs came into effect and stayed in effect. This is a 25% tariff on Mexican imports to the US and 10% on Canadian energy imports, although a higher 25% rate on non-energy imports from Canada. But for our purposes, in the oil market, it's 25% on Mexico and 10% on Canada. So to talk about the implications of this policy for European oil markets particularly, I've got George Maher-Bonnett with me, and George is our gasoline senior reporter in London. So thanks very much for joining me, George.
Thanks, Benedict.
We've been talking about these tariffs a lot, haven't we, recently? And I mean, the tone of the conversation is a huge question mark. We don't know if these tariffs are going to remain in place for the long term. We don't know if this is part of a negotiation where maybe the Canadian and Mexican governments can make more concessions and the tariffs will be lifted. And there are different signals from the Trump administration itself and different people within the Trump administration.
But even if those tariffs are rescinded, even temporarily, these concerns still remain, right?
Absolutely.
And these conditions continue to define the market, and the alternative arrangements may well come to pass if these tariffs continue
Absolutely.
To be threatened or again implemented further down the line. So
we were just saying, weren't we, that the whole conversation we're about to have is really about the hypothetical, the conditional case where these tariffs do remain in place. So, George, do you want to kick us off by telling us what do you think will happen to? Let's start with diesel. What are you hearing is going to happen to Atlantic diesel trade flows?
Sure thing. Thanks, Benedict. So I think, first of all, it's important to stress that the market has likely moved on from a wait and see approach to, taking action now. Immediately in the kind of wake of these tariffs taking effect this week, which essentially amount to the kind of firing shots of a new North American trade war. Canada is a key diesel supplier to the US. Some people involved in the trade, especially that in North America, have signaled that there'd be greater diesel selling interest from Canada to Europe. What we've immediately seen is a reduction in flat prices as a result. That is the kind of primary element that we've witnessed in at least the diesel market so far this week.
I suppose the big picture is the US gets suddenly shorter of oil in general, perhaps, but shorter of diesel, and perhaps starts looking for different sources of supply. And Canada gets longer because its product has been priced out of its largest market. So rather than all this diesel going straight down from Canada into the US, perhaps this diesel starts coming from Canada across into Europe, which is a big importer of diesel, and Europe can actually export some diesel straight back across the Atlantic into the US because Europe doesn't, have to pay that huge tariff on the product. That means a lot more diesel going in both directions across the Atlantic rather than staying on either side of it.
So diesel cargoes from sellers east of Suez, originally flagging arrival at European ports, and now in fact looking to continue their voyage westwards across the Atlantic. Market participants have been telling us. These are some interesting signals that we're hearing from the market so far, for sure.
So it's been suggested that Canadian diesel quality might not stack up to European standards, which, from looking at Canadian national specs, this is true. For example, the cetane level required in Canada is only a minimum of 40. This is the same as the US, but it's less than is typical in Europe. For example, the French cetane level has to be 46. So quality doesn't stack up, but that's not a complete obstacle to the trade, because traders are actually very comfortable treating the US quality prior to import into Europe. They can add, for example, a little bit of TNT to increase cetane level. This is absolutely routine in the very large import trade flow from the US into Europe. So probably, as you say, this has not been tested yet with large volumes from Canada, but on the face of it, probably there is a similarly comfortable, easy, relatively cheap treatment process that Canadian diesel could undertake in order to enter the European market. I've just got the numbers here, by the way. The volumes that we're talking about are Canada in 2024, in the whole year, exported about nearly 8 million tons of diesel and other gas oil, mostly to the US. About 3/4 of that went to the US. So about 5 or 6 million tons of diesel and other gas oil. Most of it is diesel, as in road fuel diesel, which is about 500,000 tons per month. So in theory, if all of that seaborne Canadian diesel export to the US were to relocate and pivot to Europe, it's 500,000 tons a month of diesel, which would be an eighth, sixth to an eighth perhaps of Europe's typical imports. So a huge extra source of supply for Europe, potentially very pressuring on European diesel prices. What are you hearing about Canada's gasoline?
Yeah, so on the gasoline side of things, Canada is also the top supplier of foreign gasoline into the US, and so it is no less an important trade flow, especially for the US, given its outsized role in the global market as a gasoline consumer. It's up there easily among the top one or two players in the world. So when we're looking at potential changes in trade flows from Canada, again, sources have been telling us that these gasoline volumes may be shipped elsewhere, just similarly in a similar vein to the diesel volumes heading to Europe. Perhaps there may well be an increase in flow from Canada to South America.
We should explain, for the benefit of listeners who may not be so deep into these markets. Europe is a huge importer of diesel, but a huge exporter of gasoline. So when Canada is looking for new markets for its diesel, Europe is right there buying lots and lots of diesel every month and could easily be a new customer for Canada. For gasoline, Canada is now going to go out and start competing with European sellers to sell gasoline into different markets. So that will be, as you say, more likely the gasoline importers in Latin America, the Caribbean, and so forth. And there may be some sort of really like for like exchange where Canada sells its gasoline to Latin American buyers who might have bought from Europe in the past, and Europe simply switches places with Canada and exports more into the US to buyers who would have bought from Canada in the past.
There's been counter arguments in the market in recent weeks that the depreciation of the loonie, so that's the US Canadian exchange rate, may actually benefit Canadian exporters, or at least neutralize the immediate effects of the 10% tariff on energy exports to the US. There is also a point worth making here that a fair volume of this gasoline that is shipped to or is exported to the US is done over land or via pipeline. So there is again a more significant volume likely heading to the US from Canada overland as well.
As you say, we don't know what the volumes are overland. The product that loads by sea, in theory, can go wherever it likes. The product that's delivered over land, realistically, may be inflexible as to where that product can be sold. If it's that the infrastructure may not exist to load that product for seaborne export, and if that's the case, and there's no extra demand in Canada to absorb that product, Canadian sellers may simply have to swallow the tariff cost and simply take a lower export margin. But for the seaborne exports, they have much more room to maneuver, and they may be able to preserve a quite reasonable export margin by selling into Europe.
I suppose it's worthwhile saying that the volume of diesel and gasoline in the market is not necessarily set to decrease unless crude flows into the US refineries from Canada are affected. In which case, then the Atlantic Basin markets would likely tighten.
Valero and PBF, who are two large refining companies on the US Gulf Coast, they've both indicated that if they have to pay this 25% tariff on Mexican crude imports, they would consider cutting crude runs. So just processing less crude overall. I suppose that's because they have the infrastructure set up not only to receive crude from Mexico, but they have the machinery set up at their refineries to process that quality of crude. And there may not be equivalent quality available in the market to replace all of that. Certainly not at an economical price, even if the crude is out there. So if these refiners cut their overall volume of crude processing, it will tend to reinforce some of these effects we've seen, some of these effects that we've described so far. So it's a bit like sanctions on Russia, isn't it?
Absolutely.
In the sense that there's a kind of simple scenario where everyone just rearranges the trade flows and the volumes involved don't change. Basically, everyone pays the shipping companies a bit more to move the products around more.
Absolutely.
And all of the trade takes longer and is a bit more vulnerable to disruption because everything is spending 3 times as long traveling.
Yes.
But then there's that's a kind of calm scenario because the volumes actually haven't changed. But then there's the more complicated scenario where some sort of piece of the production process cannot be utilized as much as before. And
absolutely.
That case with regard to the tariffs would be if the US Gulf Coast refineries actually stop producing as much, if they stop processing as much crude. It's helpful to think about the US Gulf Coast and the US Atlantic Coast almost like two different countries, right, for the purposes of oil trade, because they're totally different. The US Gulf Coast produces a huge amount of crude and refines a huge amount of crude and exports refined oil products. the US Atlantic coast refines a bit, mainly imports a huge amount of crude and of refined oil products, because the Atlantic coast, where New York and New England and so forth are located, these are real centers of demand, of consumption of products, and consumption far outstrips the production in that region. The funny thing is that even though the US Gulf Coast is such an enormous producer of crude, that wasn't so much the case for decades and decades and before fracking. And fracking produced very light, sweet crude. And because the refining machinery was designed for this heavy sour crude from Mexico and Canada, although the US Gulf Coast produces a lot of crude and refines a lot of crude, it is not, to a large extent, refining the same crude that it produces. It still relies upon crude imports because it's a different quality of crude. That's the point. Getting into the hypothetical where US Gulf Coast refiners actually cut production, I guess this depends on whether they can access crude of equivalent quality to the
That's very fair.
of the Canadian and Mexican. And
Absolutely. And this comes at a time as well, of course, that Chevron has just lost its license to operate in Venezuela. 300,000 barrels a day coming out of Venezuela, destined for US refineries, is also poised to just drop off.
For them to access crude of equivalent quality, they will need somebody else in the world to be prepared to substitute Canadian and Mexican crude for some other crude of equivalent quality, if that makes sense. But the problem may be that European refiners are actually maybe quite keen to run heavier, sourer crude from Mexico and Canada, and to take that instead of light sweet crude from the US, and to run a heavier, sourer slate overall, because European crude slates have trended lighter and sweeter for the last decade almost. So European
it might well be a welcome reprieve. Yeah.
Well, exactly, and if the point being that if the European refiners take it as a welcome reprieve for their crude slates, that means they are taking it instead of lighter, sweeter grades, which implies that the US is not doing a like-for-like swap with somebody else, where the US gets some heavy sour crude in return for its Mexican and Canadian crude that it's lost, because actually everybody is chasing this heavy sour crude, Europe and US alike. And what we can see is Repsol specifically saying that the tariffs that could push Canadian and Mexican crude out of the US, Repsol has commented, this will be good for Repsol because they will be able to run these heavier sour crudes. Long story short, Canada probably will try to sell diesel and gasoline to new markets. Mexico will probably try to sell crude to new markets. The US will probably try to buy products from new markets, gasoline and diesel. And the US will try probably to import heavy sour crudes to replace the Mexican crude, which could be from other Latin American origins, for example, but they will be in stiff competition with other refiners in places like Europe for these Latin American crudes. And it is not clear whether the US refiners would be able to make a perfect substitution for the Mexican crude that they would lose. And as we say, some US refiners have specifically said that they may have to consider cutting their overall crude throughput volume as a result of the tariffs. That, as you say, George, that would be the really serious change for Atlantic Basin markets, where there would actually be a smaller volume of refined products in the market because there'd be less refining capacity being utilized. Okay, I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much for joining me, George.
Thanks, Benedict.
And we will, if the situation develops and if the tariff policy changes, we will, I'm sure, get back on and record another discussion where we tackle the implications. So look forward to that. And listeners, I hope this has been helpful, and do keep an eye out for the podcasts we will be bringing out on a variety of other topics in the weeks to come. So thank you, and have a lovely day.
Bye bye.